I don't know if you've ever cut down a tree, but I remember being a teenager and cutting down a fairly small tree in my parents' backyard that they wanted removed. And I remember the feeling of the saw in my hand and the sawdust going into the grass, and how the rings of the tree were gradually revealed as I cut. They were revealed and destroyed at the same time. And then how I got to wrestle that tree down in a clumsy way, and because it was not that big, and then the space above it in the air. This is a story about our relation to the natural world, and it has the feeling for me of something at the root of our civilization, at the root of where we are at. Of course, historically, because it is a story 4,000 years old, dug up it was on a clay tablet. And then just poetically, it's different from a lot of other stories. It speaks about the first felling of these trees, basically. And we all live in a world that is different because of that. Whether your house is made of wood, whether you got your food from a factory farm, all those things are at play. And I'm reminded of them through this story. I've been lucky. I was given a chance to work as a ranger naturalist in Yosemite National Park for 5 years. My wife and I went, and our daughter, for 4 months of every year in the summer months, up in the Sierra Nevada, up in the mountains there, at a high elevation, about 9,000 feet. And one of my duties as a ranger naturalist was to go once or twice a week to the Tuolumne Grove of giant sequoias, and to hike down about a mile downhill to where these trees are at, in a river basin there, and spend some time with them and answer questions, of course, from people, and make sure people didn't jump the fence and tried to do strange and human things to those trees. So this story brings that to mind for sure. Those trees, the sequoias, have been there for millions of years, possibly around 120 million years. They used to be more widespread. Now they are found only in the western Sierra, there on the west coast of the United States. And the Miwok Indians, the indigenous folks who lived with those trees, as far as we can tell, they did not spend a lot of time with the trees. They did not go close to them, apparently. There's a lot of scorched earth between their culture and ours, and the Miwok are still very much around. But archaeologists, looking around, they don't find any spear points, any human remains in the groves of sequoia trees in California. So it seems like they left the trees largely alone. The European Americans found them by accident. First, there was a group called the Walker Party, named for a guy named Joseph Walker, who in 1833 stumbled through the Sierra and saw the Tuolumne Grove, the grove I used to go to. But they were starving and barely made it out of the mountains alive. Winter was coming. They had to eat their horses to survive. So they did write a record of their travels, and it was published in a book. But that book, every copy of that book, except for 2 copies, was burned in a fire thereafter. And so word about these trees did not get out to the European-American world because after that trip. So it took a while longer. That was 1833. Then 1852, someone did stumble into the trees. Now, an important thing had happened by then. The California gold rush had happened. So the Sierra Nevada mountains, which were not home to a lot of people, suddenly were crawling with thousands of people. Major corporations were trying to get the gold there. Entire hillsides were being washed away by companies which diverted rivers to do that very thing. You have to imagine the energy of the corporate world now, ExxonMobil, whatever you want to conjure up, Google, all those large-scale energies picture them set loose in the wilderness, which, of course, even now they are set loose in the wilderness. But back then, you don't want to think of the gold rush as a quaint thing of bearded guys with pans in riverbeds, which it partly was. But there was also this huge, large-scale effort to strip the wilderness of its gold. And it was tremendously damaging. It was a disaster ecologically for that whole ecosystem, of course. But in any case, there was a fellow named Augustus T. Dowd, and he was a hunter. He worked for a water company. And what was the water company doing? Well, they were building sluiceways and devising means to get water to all the folks up there who were working for the companies that were getting the gold. It was a big-scale operation, as I said. So he was a hunter for the water company, feeding the carpenters who worked for that water company, who were working to get water to the miners in the mountains. So he was out hunting one day, and he shot a grizzly bear. Grizzlies are now extinct in California. There's one on the flag, but that's the only one you will see in that state. The last one was killed in the 1920s by a hunter. But at that time, they were still around, and he shot one, and it went rampaging off, you can imagine, into the wilderness, trying to get away from this crazy maniac with a gun. Now, no one knows, of course, why the grizzly went where it did, but it went off into the Calaveras Grove of sequoia trees. That's outside Yosemite to the west a bit. And Augustus T. Dowd, he followed that grizzly, and he went into that grove of sequoias, and he forgot about the bear completely because he was completely astounded by the size of these trees, gigantic trees. So he forgot about the bear and just looked at these trees and was amazed and astounded, and then went back to camp and tried to tell his friends about it. Now, the thing is, humans are quite interesting, aren't they? None of his friends believed it. They thought he was making up stories. He could not get any of them to follow him, to go with him to where he had seen the sequoia trees. So he was telling them these stories, and they did not believe them. Now, how big are these trees? Just to give you some ideas. As I said, I was in the Tuolumne Grove a lot, and there's a tree there called Big Red, which is 23 feet in diameter. So wherever you are, if you're in your house, if you're in your car, just think about that, 23 feet thick. That's a big tree. And about, I forget the exact numbers, about 230 feet high, at least 200 feet high, a big tree. And a tree probably between 2,000 and 3,000 years old. That particular tree, I suppose, Big Red, not quite as old as this story of Gilgamesh, but wicked old nonetheless. A tree that sprouted long ago, right, before the Roman Empire really happened, before America. A tree that grew through all those changes, through the world wars, the Industrial Revolution, a tree that has seen a lot. In any case, that's Big Red, 23 feet in diameter and very tall. There's other trees around, of course, in Sequoia National Park as well. Some of the largest ones are there. Pretty much the oldest one they can tell, the oldest as far as the rings, counting the rings is the only way to ascertain the age of a giant sequoia, because there's no drill capable, even now, of drilling through there and pulling out the rings so you can count them. So there's at least one that has fallen, and they counted 3,200 rings on that tree. So a tree about 3,000 years old. That was in 1975. So in any case, that's just to give you an idea of how big these things were and are. So Mr. Dowd saw this huge grove of trees, and he was astounded, went back, nobody believed him. But a week later, he made up a story. He told them that he had killed a bear out there, a huge bear, and he needed help bringing it back. They were hunters. They could imagine a big bear. They could not imagine a giant tree. Our imaginations are the limits of our world in some way. Right now, we can imagine spaceships, time travel, but there's other things perhaps we can't imagine. At that time, a big tree was inconceivable to them. Whereas a big bear, well, yeah, they'd seen big bears before. So these guys went with him, Mr. Augustus T. Dowd. He led them to the grove of sequoia trees, and they were also amazed and astounded. You wonder what he might have said. I like to think he said, "Guys, I lied about the bear." So after that time, word got out. There was a newspaper article in the Sonora Herald, I think it was called, and word spread. and people began cutting these trees or attempting to cut them. The first tree was felled. It took 25 men 10 days to cut this tree. 25 men who were lumberjacks. They knew how to cut trees down. It took 25 men 10 days to cut down the first sequoia tree. They did not have saws big enough, so they had to drill repeatedly into it to get saws in there. It was too big for any tools they had on hand. But eventually they succeeded, and they felled that first tree. And then they felled some more. Now, sequoia trees, when they fall, they shatter into like a million pieces. So you can't get a board that's 10 feet across from a tree like that. People quickly learned. So these grand royal trees end up becoming things like fence posts and small things like that instead of large boards and things like that. People from the beginning had the feeling that they wanted to prove this to people. So they took a slice of one of these trees and they put it on a train and they sent it to New York City. It got to New York City, but nobody believed them. Just as the hunters had not believed Mr. Dowd, so nobody believed this. It was called the California hoax. That's what the newspapers called it. People thought perhaps somebody had cooked this up somehow. They'd created that. They'd manufactured that ring of tree. It just seemed impossible. Then, in a further effort to prove this to people and spread the word, there's a tree called the Mother of the Forest tree in the Calaveras Grove, and they stripped 120 feet of its bark, put it on a train, went to New York, and then it went to London in England, and it was set up in the Crystal Palace there. Now, of course, doing that kills the tree, so the Mother of the Forest was killed. I hope you're hearing the resonances here with Gilgamesh. The Mother of the Forest tree, the tree we named the Mother of the Forest, was killed because we stripped all the bark and we sent it to London, England. Now, the bark was then burned in a fire. The Crystal Palace was destroyed in 1866, and the bark from that tree along with it. So people began to cut these trees immediately. Also, other people cried out against this and said, there's no way, you can't cut those trees. They're amazing. In the end, about 34% of the existing sequoias were cut. If you wonder what would have happened if they did not shatter upon falling, if you had been able to get big boards out of them. If you had been able to do that, perhaps the history would have been a little different, and they would not have survived as much as they have. Today, you can find sequoia trees, again, only in California. I mean, you can plant them other places. I should revise that. But they don't always do as well. They need snow and they need fire. They reproduce after forest fires. The heat of the fire opens their cones and makes them propagate. So without that, you really need human intervention to make them work. So you can find them in different places around the world, but naturally occurring sequoias are only in the Sierra Nevada of California. And these trees are very adaptable in some ways, but in other ways not. They can't move, of course. They are trees. So with climate change, it is anybody's guess if they will survive. So knowing that history, feeling it in our bones, in our bodies, and sitting here in our houses in a world of cars and electric lights, I personally find it hard not to hear this story and feel a big sense of dreadful connection, a kinship with this story, like it or not, when Gilgamesh and Enkidu go to cut down the trees so that Uruk can have more beautiful houses. Uruk, which is, of course, a desert town, which is largely clay and sand, and now he's going to bring trees to it, which, of course, changes everything. So there's a lot of grief in this story, and I invite you to feel that grief. I invite you to be open to that, because I think it'll make us wiser and more aware, which is something we all desperately need. Thank you for listening to this podcast. There are more stories on my website, which is jayleeming.com, jayleeming.com. If you're able to support this podcast through Patreon, please do so. That's what keeps this thing going. And thanks to all who have supported this and continue to do so. Take care and be well.